It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The weirdest thing about Kemi Badenoch's behaviour this morning is that all of the racists are going to be furious that we're talking about Diane Abbott again. I mean, I could probably look at my inbox and find you some evidence. Here you go. Here's John. FFS, he writes, not again. Here's Dale says, can we have a couple of hours? Not on Diane Abbott, please. They're going to be absolutely livid that the story has been resurrected, has been revivified by the business secretary. What's the second funniest phrase in the English language at the moment? Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch. You know what the funniest is? Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. God, what a time to be alive. But the story has been revivified, reinflated with an incredibly ugly intervention from, I think, in some ways, perhaps the most prominent black female politician in the post-Diane Abbott period would be Kemi Badenoch. And so she has, while trying to keep people like our correspondents there sweet, she's done the exact opposite. She has given more attention, more ammunition almost to the people who remain furious that Frank Hester's filthy money remains festering in Tory party coffers, all £15 million of it. The addition of that extra £5 million reported at the end of the last week has not been denied. It's I'm not going to lie to you, and I don't want you to get upset with me. I wasn't planning on talking about this again today. I know that the story has not been resolved satisfactorily. I know that the heartbreaking testimony we took last week from people who feel the horror of what Frank Hester said, which is almost everybody, except it would seem the Tory cabinet. I know that demands more attention, but there is, this isn't a science, it's a craft, it's an art if you prefer, if you're feeling a bit pretentious, and you can't talk about the same story. It made the weekend. I saw that David Lammy had a lot to say on the subject. Sangeeta did, Natasha Devon, Matthew Wright, some of our great colleagues at the weekend were still clearly very exercised by it. But I thought that by this morning it would have moved on. And I think it had. And then people started asking Kemi Badenoch about what had happened and what would happen next. And suddenly it's front and centre once again. I think Nick probably asked the best questions, although she didn't cover herself in glory in any of her interviews this morning. This was among the most staggering. I find this an almost unbelievable intervention from the member of Rishi Sunak's government, who was the first to call the comments racist, although she then misled her Twitter followers by claiming that Hester had apologised for his racism, when, of course, he still hasn't. He's apologised for being rude. And to hear people, including Badenoch, describe the comments as flippant. I asked you last week if there were any circumstances in which you could imagine someone calling for you to be shot as being flippant. You'd consider it flippant. And saying it with proper hatred, because, as he told us, Diane Abbott makes him hate all black women, although he claimed that he wasn't making any reference to her gender or her race when he claimed, or her skin colour, when he claimed that she made him hate all black women. But anyway, have a listen to what Kemi Badenoch had to say today. And then I want you to tell me what you think is going on. All right? Because someone explained to me not long ago that there's a form of racism sometimes in a white person saying, I can't understand how a black person can say that. And I think we need to be very careful to bear that in mind. In a way, if I were to say I find it more shocking when Kemi Badenoch says this than I would do if a white politician did, then I am expecting her skin colour to play a role in her opinions. Now, this isn't an opinion about immigration, though, or this isn't an opinion about refugees or asylum seekers, which is where that distinction is important. This is an opinion about what racism is and what racism isn't. And it seems to me plausible that the more likely you are to be on the receiving end of a certain type of racism, the more likely you are to abhor it or to condemn it or to recognise it. Which makes me somewhat surprised. I'm struggling, possibly as a white man, I'm struggling this morning to understand how a black politician can try to minimise what, for my money, is the worst example of explicit racism from a prominent public figure that I can remember. I don't want to open up the phone lines for a competition on that, but, this man is bankrolling the Tory party, pretty much single-handedly. the percentage of cash with which they'll be fighting the next general election that has come from Frank Hester's profits largely made from contracts that were given to him by the Conservative government in the first place. Welcome to Brexit Britain. But the man is pretty much bankrolling the whole Tory party. And yet he's called for a black politician to be shot. And then another black politician comes along and talks about how it's flippant and he didn't really mean it and he's apologised. And the bit that really threw me was the bit where she claimed that he wasn't really talking about Diane Abbott at all. I want Diane Abbott to be shot, but I'm not really talking about Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott makes me hate all black women, but I'm not really talking about Diane Abbott. I don't know what's more mad, to be honest with you. The claim that he's not referencing her gender and race when he calls her the reason for him wanting to hate all black women, or the claim that he's not talking about Diane Abbott, which Kemi Badenoch has made this morning, when he says that he is wants Diane Abbott to be shot. I don't get it, and I do wonder whether my own ethnicity is part of my problem here. Maybe it's easier to understand if you're from a black family, a black background. You can look at what Kemi Badenoch has said and think, yeah, she's actually got a point. There's some bits of it, we'll have a little look in a minute, there's some bits of it where I do recognise this dismissal, if you like, of some depictions of racism. I don't know if you remember the 1980s when political correctness was the phrase that they used to describe what is now called woke. And they would pretend, usually the Sun newspaper would pretend that children weren't allowed to sing Bar Bar Black Sheep in schools anymore, or that blackboards were being renamed. And there were some genuine examples of what you might call excessive concern on these issues. But there was a narrative abroad, put there largely by some of Rupert Murdoch's most racist lieutenants, some of whom remain in positions of prominence in his empire, some of whom have been shown the door a while ago. But you would feed into this narrative that any complaints about racism were bogus. You see it now in my inbox. You'll get people saying that they're playing the race card or they've got a chip on their shoulder. And you just have to ignore stories like one that emerged at the weekend of a young black lad in the northeast being abused on camera in the most unimaginable way. I know that arrests have been made, so we'll say no more about that at the moment. But the denial of racism is a crucial part of racism. I don't know if you've noticed that white racists now on social media will accuse politicians of colour complaining about racism of being racist. Even somebody like me will be described as anti-white by white people when I simply say, wouldn't it be nice if you stopped describing black people in the way that Frank Hester has described Diane Abbott? So it's all of this stuff is as old as the hills. And the big call of last week was distraction. I mean, the exhausting element of this. It's what it does to people of colour. They constantly have to be saying it's not fair for someone who's given 15 million quid to the Tories to be calling for a black politician to be shot. It's not fair to claim that these comments are flippant. It's not right to claim that he wasn't. And of course, it means that we're not talking about stuff that in some context is more important. But we will. We've got 3 hours. Here's a little clip. Have a proper listen to this because I think it's off the charts horrible.
Last week, you were the first minister to label Frank Hester's alleged comments as racist. I won't repeat those comments. Should the Conservatives give back the many millions that he's donated?
No, I don't think so at all. I'm actually quite surprised that people suggest this. This was something that happened 5 years ago. He wasn't talking to Diane Abbott. It wasn't even really about Diane Abbott. He used her in a reference that was completely unacceptable. He's apologised for it. I think that it is far more important that we accept the apology and not move on. It's taking too much attention, I think, away from what is actually meaningful to the people around the country.
So it's okay to take millions of pounds from people who make racist comments?
That's not what I said. He did not make those comments yesterday. He made those comments in 2019.
No, he did make racist comments.
I'm very aware of what he said, Nick. I don't need you to tell me what is and what isn't racist.
I wouldn't seek to do that.
The point I'm making.
Yes, I just want to make clear that you can make racist comments and the Conservatives will still take your money.
The point I'm making is that when people apologise, they should be forgiven. And these comments were in no way reflective of the work that he has been doing, why we have taken his money. We need to get to a point where we stop chasing people around and looking everywhere for the racism. The person he's made the comments about, if I may finish, please, the person he's made the comments about has, of course, been suspended from the party for the same thing. We are ending up in a spiral where everybody is accusing and counter-accusing around racism. I think we need to move away from these things and actually focus on what matters to people.
Here. But doesn't he at least have to accept the comments were racist? The donor himself.
I think he's apologised for them.
But hasn't accepted
we've
they're
answered
racist,
these
so
questions. I haven't spoken to him, but we've been talking about this for well over a week now. This is trivia, Nick. I'm sorry, but I really do believe it is.
It is 13 minutes after 10, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where two elements of that extraordinary exchange with Nick Ferrari jump out at me. The first is the claim that it wasn't about Diane Abbott. I don't know whether that's tin-eared or obnoxious or both. If you're talking about another woman, I don't know whether the business associate that he was talking about is black or not, but I do know that he talked about her and essentially then added, it's a bit like Diane Abbott. She makes me want to hate all black women. I mean, an extraordinary thing to say. But to claim that he wasn't talking about Diane Abbott is, just obnoxious to the point of incredulity on my part. The words, in case anyone's forgotten, it's like trying not to be racist, but you see Diane Abbott on the TV and you're just like, you just want to hate all black women because she's there. And I don't hate all black women at all, but I think she should be shot. So the first comment is that it's not about Diane Abbott. And the second comment is that it's trivia and that it's an example of chasing around looking, if you like, too hard for racism, which made me think of stories about blah, blah, black sheep and some slightly over exuberant. Most of these stories turn out not to be true, by the way. And I look at the flag story in my first book, How to Be Right, and I look at the Winterval story, the idea that Christmas had been banned. It's astonishing how easy it is to find the truth if you want to. But of course, if you're writing for The Sun in that era and later, you don't want your readers to know the truth. You just want your readers to be angry with the people who are calling out the bigotries and the prejudices. 10:15 is the time. And there it is, really. I don't understand why she has done this. I don't understand why she is seeking to trivialise Frank Hester's obnoxious behaviour. I don't understand why she is lying about the comments not being about Diane Abbott. I don't understand why she's lying about him having apologised when he hasn't. He's apologised for being rude. And I don't understand, and this is the crucial point, I don't understand why she's tried to do both. She's tried to condemn him for his racist comments and was the first to do so and embarrassed Rishi Sunak by doing this. But within a week, she's actually backpedaling faster from the obnoxiousness of what this donor has done than anybody else in the cabinet has done so far. So extraordinarily, she has been both the first and most outspoken critic of what he said in the cabinet, albeit that she lied about the apology. And simultaneously, she's now become the loudest denier of reality, the loudest trivializer of what he did, and the most prominent, if you like, contributor to the conversation from a cabinet level position to minimize the abuse, to pretend that it's not a big deal, to call it trivia and flippant. So I don't know about the sensibility of Kemi Badenoch's background in the pertinence of my question. I don't know whether or not it's appropriate for me to say I don't understand how anyone can talk like this, but I really don't understand how a black woman can. Not in the context of immigration or refugee applications or asylum, but specifically in the context of anti-black woman racism. Do you see what I mean? To say I hate all black women because of Diane Abbott. He's not talking about me, he's talking about her. So that just, for me at least, puts a very different patina on it. So explain it to me. From whatever angle you want. We don't normally do Kremlinology and wild speculation, but there are two politicians currently vying to lead the Conservative Party. She's one of them. The other is the woman with the sword, Penny Mordaunt. The state of British politics can't be better summed up, really, than by saying, here you've got a woman saying that an attack on all black women wasn't actually about Diane Abbott or was trivial and we should all have moved on. And then you've got a woman most famous for giving a mad speech, hurting herself on a reality television diving programme and managing to hold a sword aloft for 51 minutes at King Charles's coronation. Why? What? You explain to me why Kemi Badenoch has decided to side with Frank Hester against all black women. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Okay? It's 10:18. If you hit those numbers now, you will get through. And I'm glad we're talking about it again. I wish that it had never happened, but I'm glad that we're talking about it again because from where I'm sitting, it's the polar opposite of trivial. It's desperately important. It's an issue of national importance because the party of government is being bankrolled by a man who has said unthinkably awful things. And they are excusing him. They are letting him off the hook. I can't change that. You can't change that. We can't demand justice until justice is delivered. But what we can do is refuse to accept any attempt to trivialise it or undermine it, to refuse to let it just become yesterday's news, to become fish and chip newspaper. It is a matter of epic importance that the man bankrolling the party of government, the man essentially writing the cheques upon which they will fight the next general election, is being allowed a free pass on the most vile and explicit of racism, upon wishing a black politician, a black woman, dead, on wanting her to be shot. That is not something that gets filed under councils banning bar black sheep or schools renaming blackboards. This is an act of almost unbelievable indecency in the context of public discourse. And that's why I can't get my head around why Kemi Badenoch has A, brought it back to the top of the agenda today, and B, even framed the thoughts that she articulated to Nick Ferrari by essentially siding with the £15 million donor against, to use his phrase, against all black women. It's 10:20. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Gary's in Halifax. The Tory hierarchy, he writes, know that Hester's racism will chime with Reform Limited types. They daren't condemn Hester properly and risk losing racist supporters, which works as an analysis up to Kemi Badenoch wading in from what appears to be that perspective this morning, which doesn't make sense. It may seem mad, says Matty, to constantly flip-flop and go into territory such as this, but maybe that's the objective, to persuade people that politics is full of liars, so there's no point engaging with any of it. And Mick in Fareham makes a point that a lot of you make in terms. So according to Kemi Badenoch, if I stood in Trafalgar Square and shouted through a loudspeaker that Sunak should be shot for being brown, then as long as I apologised and moved on, I wouldn't be cautioned or arrested. I don't know what she'd say to that. Maybe as long as it only happened in 2019 and you apologise for being rude, then yeah, we should all stop complaining about that. It's trivial and we should all move on. I genuinely don't get it. I caught myself a bit last year saying that a bit too often. I don't get it. Explain it to me. It's a bit lazy in a way because it makes you do all the work. You turn the radio on in the morning to have me to explain things to you that you can then either disagree or agree with. And to say to you, I don't know what's going on here. You tell me. I can't do that every day. I like doing it some days, but it should be a rare treat for me. I don't get this. I've got some answers to the question, none of them very nice, but I don't get it. None of them feel like, you know, when you finish a video game and everything slots into the final screen, you finish a crossword and you sit back and look at it and it's done, it's finished. I get it now. Just don't. Az is in Forest Hill. Az, what's going on?
James, good morning. How are you?
Very well. Well, confused, but you knew that already.
Yeah. When I first heard this story last week,
yes,
the first thing I said was, please don't ask black people to explain how they feel.
No.
Please don't ask us. Because if in 2024 people don't understand how we feel, you've missed everything. You really have missed everything.
I understand what you're saying.
And of course, people, you know, commentariats were calling on black people to give commentary on, you know, oh, you've been shot, tell us how you feel.
Yeah.
It's bizarre, right? And this is what you shouldn't do. Because now you're traumatizing people who've already been traumatized. It's not necessary. And as you mentioned, that young schoolboy being caught on video being abused by... And so you see the same things in the United States of America.
Yes.
I've got two books in front of me. One's by an African-American woman. One's by a British Congolese woman. The first one's called Black Fatigue by Mary Frances Winters. And this is one of the issues that we have to navigate these issues on a regular basis, and it is tiring. And chapter 4 says racism literally makes you sick. It is a pre-existing condition, and she's absolutely correct. And so the other chapters go on, I can't breathe, black children's fatigue, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
Kemi Badenoch, if you listen to what she said, is that she said she never experienced racism. Well, if you had
she said that she said that previously, I think. That's not part of
exactly.
Has she said that? Are we sure? 100% sure?
I think she might have said that.
Okay.
And that's because she spent some time living and growing up in Nigeria. I don't like even saying that because it's a complicated discussion for me because my parents were born there. I was born here, but my grandparents are not Nigerian.
Okay.
So the whole thing is a mess.
But she can't say that. She can just mean she's never been on the specific receiving end of racism, which I haven't either. But I've experienced racism. I experienced racism when I read Frank Hester's comments about Diane Abbott.
Exactly. So in her own experience, what she says is that she came from a country where everybody looked like her. So there will be discrimination. It just won't be racism in the way that people who are further away from the continent will experience it. And the way I try to explain this to people is here in the UK versus in the United States of America, it's like here we've got fine wine and over there they've got raw grapes. That's very visceral. You can see it like that. Or use the other metaphor of looking at an iceberg, and we all know that it's just the top 10% or 8% that you can see peeking above the water. You can see the race. It's George Floyd, it's Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. But if you really want to see the racism, you have to look underneath the water. And then you'll say, oh my God, it's like when you said on Friday, you pull back the curtain like Toto did in Wizard of Oz. That's when you'll see everything. And you have to look for it. Doesn't mean it's not there.
So this is a generous analysis of Kemi Badenoch in a sense that you're just saying she means it. She doesn't want to see it, so she doesn't see it. She's not lying. She just doesn't want to see it.
You can really believe that it doesn't exist. It doesn't. Look, Dave, you know the adage. If a tree falls down and you're not there to witness it, does it make a sound? We've all heard that when we were growing up, right? So the tree makes, we know physics, it must make a sound. Just because you weren't there to witness it, it doesn't mean it doesn't make.
And you cling on to that for reasons perhaps even of self-protection, self-preservation. I mean, I presume that if I were black, I would rather believe that racism didn't exist. It would make my life feel a lot easier.
And this is where you get into it becomes really sticky and tricky to then navigate this.
Yes,
some people say, yeah, I'm never a victim, I'm not a victim, I'm not a victim. You remember you said you watched American Fiction the other day.
Yeah.
I heard you say that last week.
Yeah, great
and at
film.
the end of the film, what happened to the protagonist, Jeffrey Wright? Yeah?
Yes.
They burst into the award ceremony. And then
It was one of several possible endings. I don't want to do a spoiler. I'm only holding back for people who haven't seen the film. I'm not being. No, exactly. But yeah, it plays into an awful lot of what you've discussed.
The following day, James, in the news, a 15-year-old boy was shot dead in the United States of America. Needless to say, he was African American.
Yeah.
And needless to say, James, he was holding something in his hand. And if we go down that route, you find out it doesn't matter what he had in his hand. It was just because he was black. And so
you've taken me out to the news, and I've got.
Yes.
So I'm just going to read you something that's come in the last 5 seconds from Barry. Barry has written this, and I don't know how pertinent this is to the broader conversation. Barry has written, "Move on, James, for God's sake. Even a black woman is saying enough is enough."
And many people have that view. And then last week, of course,
not many black women do.
Many black women are going to stand firm. They all went to Hackney to support Diane Abbott in her constituency.
It's very powerful. But Barry is loving this. Barry is loving a black woman saying enough is enough because he hates these conversations because they make him...
Of course, because it makes him uncomfortable. It makes him uncomfortable.
But I don't know, neither of us know how deliberate the wooing of Barry may have been or whether that's just what you could call a sort of, a consequential win as opposed to the whole purpose of the play in the first place. Thank you, Az. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts is here now with your headline. 10:35 is the time. Listen to this from Jason, but listen to the end because I don't jump to any conclusions after the first couple of lines. Jason writes, "I really don't like Diane Abbott. I am one of the travellers that, in her words, don't experience racism. But attacking her in such a way and then belittling her entire experience, as Kemi Badenoch has done, is one of the worst things I can remember the Tories doing. Kemi Badenoch has made it worse and more difficult for black women across the country. I set that against Barry's message. Barry saying, even a black woman is saying, "Stop, we should move on and stop talking about this. Why won't you listen to her?" Find one black woman saying what Barry wants to hear, and it gives him confidence that when he tells people to stop complaining about abuse, to stop complaining about racism, to stop complaining about discrimination, he's within his rights. He's got a point. But that from Jason, and that letter that Diane Abbott remains suspended from the Labour Party for, was, extraordinarily inept and unpleasant. I understand what she was trying to say. There's a rather good interview that David Baddiel does with his own niece, who is mixed race, that was doing the rounds on social media this weekend, when she has a Jewish dad and a black mum, and she just explains the different experience of racism that a Jewish man has, because you cannot immediately tell that he's Jewish if you pull him over in his car or whatever it is, as opposed to his mum. So Diane Abbott was trying to explain that distinction, but she did so appallingly badly, spectacularly badly, to the point of genuine and grave offence. A suspension was the right thing to do. But it doesn't, of course, play into the current story, because the right not to be abused for your race doesn't depend upon your past behaviour. It depends entirely upon your race, which is what makes Kemi Badenoch's intervention this morning so bizarre to me, so unpleasant, I think, to me. To call it trivia, literally call it trivia. I don't hate all black women, but I think she should be shot. It's trivia. 10:38 is the time. It's just not, is it? It's just not trivia. Cecilia is in Salisbury. Cecilia, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I think Kemi Badenoch has two things that she's doing here. I think the first one is that she realises that Frank Hester is very wealthy, source of a great deal of money, and looking to the future, if she thinks she's going to become the leader of the Conservative Party, then she's going to need that money in the future. She's obviously not bothered about taking money from somebody like him.
No.
And the second, I think, has just been backed up by a couple of things that have just been said. She is trivialising it, because she's able to say, well, if a black woman doesn't think it's a big deal, what are all you people getting excited about?
Yes.
And I think that those two things underline exactly where she's coming from. And I think it's frightening, absolutely frightening.
So the only point where that stumbles as an analysis is that she was the first to come out, before Sunak did, to describe Frank Hester's comments as racist. And admittedly, it was accompanied by a mealy-mouthed attempt to pretend that he'd apologised specifically for his racism when he hadn't. But she had, at the time, and for about an hour, she had gone further than anybody else in the cabinet. So
yeah, but don't you think? Sorry to interrupt you, but don't you think she was scoring points over Rishi Sunak?
Yes. Yes, and so cynical is that. So cynical and if you like, hypocritical or morally corrupt is that process, that it's stupid to say, well, hang on, that cancels that out. She can't have done that and that at the same time. In that moment, scoring points over Rishi Sunak was more important than anything else. And now minimising Frank Hester's racism is more important than anything else. So the two things can be simultaneously true, even though to bears of very little brain like me, Cecilia, they seem to be contradictory.
Well, I don't think they are, because I think now that the Penny Mordaunt thing has become much more to the fore, she's obviously hacked off that she's not going to be looked upon as the next obvious successor.
So she's come out today.
So she's having another go, and she will come out and say anything that she thinks will get her into Downing Street.
And at the moment, it's obviously the Conservative Party membership that will make that final decision, and they are unlikely to be unduly troubled by the kind of thoughts and words shared by Frank Hester. Thank you, Cecilia. The mention of Penny Mordaunt, we have a problem here. It's not a massive problem, but every conversation I'm tempted to have with you about the travails of the Conservative Party falls into two possible traps, and sometimes it manages to fall into both of them. The first is that they all end up sounding the same. In a way, this conversation about Kemi Badenoch falls into trap one, which is, why are they doing such awful things and who are they trying to appeal to? That is pretty much every Conservative public intervention at the moment could be handled as a phone-in under the question, why are they doing such awful things and who are they trying to appeal to? I'll tell you the figure that has now been put upon the head of every potential refugee deported to Rwanda, how much each one is likely to cost if it ever actually happens. And again, you would find yourself wondering, why are they doing such awful things? And to whom is it designed to appeal? But the second problem we've got is that the election is probably still 6 months away. April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, 8 months away. I mean, the question about current tactics, current leadership jostling, Penny Mordaunt in the newspapers yesterday as becoming a possible receptacle of dissatisfaction with Rishi Sunak. I would do a phone-in on that today, on Monday the, whatever it is, of March 2024, the 18th of March, day after Paddy's Day. And you know, it's 7 or 8 months hence. And that just makes your heart sink. Are we going to have 7 or 8 months of this nonsense? I don't know. But here we are. 10:42 is the time. The curious behaviour, the curious conduct of Kemi Badenoch and your explanation of it. David is in Sevenoaks. David, what's going on?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking my call. I think I share your befuddlement, as I'm sure that 99.9% of your listeners do right now. But I think that there's a much bigger picture here, and this is the key. You know, I think this is the latest illustration in what has become quite a long-running saga of Tory voices coming out. You've had 30p Lee, you've had Gullis, you've had the bloke with the double-barreled name, I can't remember his name.
Yes.
And what they're doing is they know, or at least I say they know, they believe that there is more benefit to them in appealing to the constituency of the electorate who will drink this Kool-Aid or bar.
I don't know. I was thinking about this before she even gave these interviews this morning. It's not, and I think I need to be a little bit more careful about calling too many people racist. It's not necessarily that they would agree with what Frank Hester said or approve of some of the viler contributions to public discourse that we've witnessed over the years. It's more perhaps that they think too much time is spent trying to address it, or they think too much time is spent trying to, because that's who she's appealing to. That horrible line today about, you know, we've got to stop running around looking for racism, or words to that effect. It's not necessarily appeasing or appealing to explicit racists. It's appealing more to people who think, why do they get all the attention? Why are we always talking about how unfair their lives are when my life is unfair as well? Why doesn't anyone ever worry about me?
Yeah, but remember, with this, as I describe it, the core constituency of the electorate they're trying to appeal to. These people, it's not just about racism. These are the same people that the Brexit headbangers, the people that get all angry when they watch GBBs and they hear somebody talking about the fact that there's a pub in Dorset that has decided to rename their ploughman's lunch a plough person's lunch.
Yes.
They're the same people. And all you need to do to trigger these people is come up with a little soundbite, whether it's got a racist angle to it or it's something that they can dismiss as yet more wokery, quote unquote, then you've got them. And the only thing I can assume is that Tories have made a calculation that it is worth sacrificing their intellectual credibility in order to win the vote.
And then we're back to that thing, which I probably shouldn't say out loud too often because it rather undermines our own time together, but you're back to that thing of why are they doing such awful things and who are they trying to appeal to? That constituency of people you've just described is relatively tiny and already flirting with the reflux party. So why are they all putting so much effort into wooing that type of voter when they're 20 points behind in the polls as a consequence of the opposite or a very different type of voter? It's a strange one. 10:45 is the time. I falsely claimed that she was holding trade talks with Canada, falsely accused the post office boss of lying, and falsely claimed to have had meetings with LGBT groups. Nicholas suggests in a tweet we should probably be seeking a rather more reliable source of information. You make a valid point. A couple of phone lines free if you want to contribute to this conversation before 11 o'clock. The question really is, how has the Minister for Women and Equalities ended up essentially describing an attack upon a black woman as trivial? Why? Given that I think this is a permissible parameter of the conversation, given that she is a black woman. It's an attack on all black women. Diane Abbott makes me want to hate all black women. And then the most prominent black female politician in government comes out and says it's trivial. And we've got to stop looking for racism. I don't get it. I still don't get it, although I'm a little bit clearer than I was at 10 o'clock. It's 10 to 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think we'll just listen again to these words because I never know. I probably bore you a bit, don't I, when I worry about this stuff out loud. The relationship between our time together, the conversations we have together, and the the news agenda, the stories that are the most important are not necessarily the stories that will concern us most of a morning. But the intervention from the Women and Equalities Minister on the case of the £15 million donor and his racist attacks upon Diane Abbott is extraordinary. And it is because of Kemi Badenoch that it's been propelled back into our conversation today. And I tweeted earlier this morning before we came on that there were a variety of reasons to explain why she has done what she has done. She never really meant her criticism last week. She just wanted to cause trouble for Sunak, who hadn't criticised the donor. Option two, she's been made aware of just what would happen to the party without Frank Hester's filthy lucre, without his moolah, without his spondulics. Number three, which has popped up quite a lot today in our conversation, she needs the support of racists to be leader. And I'd qualify racists a bit with people who probably don't deserve that description, but who do feel that we spend far too long, because they're constantly being told by right-wing media that we spend far too long considering matters such as this one, when really we should be doing more to help people like them. And option four, she's a blithering idiot. And she's just like Dominic Cummings' description of Boris Johnson, a supermarket trolley with a wonky wheel. And then option five, all of the above. So listen to the full exchange with Nick, or quite a decent sized chunk of it. Then we'll go to Jamie and Louis after that. But I tell you what worried me last week, and I told you this. I could feel my own emotions calming, and I don't want to. I want this to stay raw. I want this story to stay raw. I want this to remain front and centre, not to the exclusion of all else, but as an example of just how ugly things have now become due to this iteration of the Tory party, due to this ecosystem that has been created since 2016, just what is now allowed, just what has been brought in. A man can make tens of millions of pounds in profits from government contracts and then give back £15 million to the party of government and then go unpunished and see his cash retained even after he is reported to have made I borderline arrestable racist observations about the single most abused politician of our era. And that's why it's important. That's why probably I'm so confused as to why Kemi Badenoch has reignited the conversation so violently this morning. But here she is.
Last week you were the first minister to label Frank Hester's alleged comments as racist. I won't repeat those comments. Should the Conservatives give back the many millions that he's donated?
No, I don't think so at all. I'm actually quite surprised that people suggest this. This was something that happened 5 years ago. He wasn't talking to Diane Abbott. It wasn't even really about Diane Abbott. He used her in a reference that was completely unacceptable. He's apologized for it. I think that it is far more important that we accept the apology and not move on. It's taking too much attention, I think, away from what is actually meaningful to the people around the country.
So it's okay to take millions of pounds from people who make racist comments?
That's not what I said. He did not make those comments yesterday. He made those comments in 2019.
No, he did make racist comments.
I'm very aware of what he said, Nick. I don't need you to tell me what is and what isn't racist.
I wouldn't seek to do that.
The point I'm making.
Yes, I just want to make clear that you can make racist comments and the Conservatives will still take your money.
The point I'm making is that when people apologise, they should be forgiven. And these comments were in no way reflective of the work that he has been doing, why we have taken his money. We need to get to a point where we stop chasing people around and looking everywhere for the racism. The person he's made the comments about, if I may finish, please, the person he's made the comments about has, of course, been suspended from the party for the same thing. we are ending up in a spiral where everybody is accusing and counter-accusing around racism. I think we need to move away from these things and actually focus on what matters to people.
Here. But doesn't he at least have to accept the comments were racist? The donor himself.
I think he's apologised for them.
But he
this,
hasn't accepted
we've
they're
answered
racist,
these
so
questions. I haven't spoken to him, but we've been talking about this for well over a week now. This is trivia, Nick. I'm sorry, but I really do believe it is.
Trivia. I mean, listen to it for the third time. It's arguably it's an even harder listen. She's absolutely wrong. I can't go any further than that. It's horribly wrong what she's saying. So horribly and obviously wrong that some of our confusion, if you like, about where she is coming from or why she is doing it will probably be unsatisfied, will probably go unresolved. Jamie's in Waltham Forest. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm okay. What's on your mind?
First time caller. I think you're amazing at what you do. Master your craft. Great for your show, finally.
Thank you.
Here's my thoughts. As a young-ish, actually quite old black person in the United Kingdom, I want to just draw attention to a book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And in that book, she goes some way to explaining what it is that Kemi Badenoch is doing right now, which looks at the idea of self-policing, like ethnic minorities self-policing. So if you picture the black policemen shooting black people in America, or black security guards jumping on the case of young black people in shops, in this instance, Kemi Badenoch, it very much appears, is the, I say, victim of her own circumstance, in terms of I think she actually believes what she is saying, that she wants to excel in her career and be accepted by her peers. And
this would fit with the attempts to condemn critical race theory or some of the other contributions that she's made to public discourse. And also a few people picking up on one of the uglier things that she just said. Diane Abbott hasn't called for anybody to be shot. So obviously when she said to Nick that Diane Abbott had been suspended for the same offence, that wasn't true either.
Not true.
But you're talking about racial hierarchies, essentially, aren't you?
Yes, yeah. And also, James, I think it's interesting that he goes on to say more in his statement. In what he says about Diane Abbott, he goes on to talk about food. You know the element of food he mentions? You see her eating food and someone else.
I think that was in reference to the other woman, actually. I think Gary Young made the point you made this weekend, but I think he got that wrong as well. It could be me that's got it wrong. But he's talking about two women, one of whom we know nothing about except that Frank Hester didn't like her and he wanted her to be fired. And somehow he brought Diane Abbott into the conversation as an example of someone else who he hates, who makes him want to hate all black women.
I don't understand what Kemi is saying from a personal point of view.
No.
But when I look at her circumstance, the circle she's moving in, the world she wants to succeed inside of, that hierarchy there, the caste system in place there, would suggest that she actually believes that it is flippant, that it is... that
this doesn't matter. This doesn't matter. We should move. It's trivial. It's not the same. We spend too much. I think Wilkerson's book actually... is more prescriptive than some other books in that genre, isn't it? And actually does offer up ideas on how you can dismantle what you describe, how the caste system, because it's a human construct, it can be destructed by humans as well. But it's unlikely to happen, I suppose, when you have prominent politicians coming from the place that she appears to have come from this morning. Thank you, Jamie. Last word on this, I think, to Louis, who's in Guildford. Louis, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Since this thing broke out, I've really held my peace not to comment, but just today, I couldn't not for the sake of my black children. I've got two girls, and we live in Surrey. And I remember not long ago in Ashford, a black child was nearly beaten to death while people were cheering, for that to happen. And hearing a politician condoning another person saying a black woman should be shot makes me just almost want to jump out and say things which would not be right as well. Just for example, shall we say that today we realize somebody was a pedophile? Last 5 years, we just say, oh no, that's just fine. It's trivial. When we discover
there's a sort of statute of limitations upon offence.
Exactly. That somebody murdered somebody 10 years from today we discover it and say, oh, let's just.
Well, we're talking. We probably don't need to conflate actions with words. It would be somebody being vilely and profoundly anti-Semitic 5 years ago, and a conservative politician coming forward today to call it trivial and say that it doesn't really matter. I don't think we need to go into actions, criminal actions. We can stay in the realms of hideous rhetoric to make valid comparisons.
Let's stay with rhetoric, James,
Yes.
and then say, for example, if we replace these words, as you say, actually, with Jewish words, when are we really going to call this Conservative Party racist? If this were a Labour Party like it happened a few weeks ago, it was about the Labour Party being so anti-Semitic. Now that the ministers come and said this today, when are we really going to call this Conservative Party racist? Because it took them so long to even condemn it. And then try to revert it.
And you know, the fellow who left them a couple of weeks ago, talking about wanting his country back, leaves hanging the question of who do they want? Where do they want their country back from? Who do they want their country back from? Who is he talking about when he says that he wants his country back?
Very smelly, James.
Well, thank you, Louis. You've taken me right up to the news. You're referring to an incident outside a school, I think, not long ago, where a young black girl was being viciously attacked by at least three other women while parents stood around and, indeed, as Louis said, offered up words. It seemed words of encouragement. It's a funny one, that, isn't it? It's a weird old story, but it's a weird old country, and it's a profoundly unpleasant old party. It's 11:01. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. I think it is unlikely that Vladimir Putin will be having any sleepless nights anytime soon over the fact that he has been attacked by Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Defence in the United Kingdom this week. However, Shapps did say something that was sort of mildly diverting. I can go no further because essentially comparing Putin to Stalin, which is a bit historically illiterate, but there are definitely parallels. And it focuses attention upon the fact that, as you may or may not know, there were some elections in Russia this weekend. And Vladimir Putin's done terribly. He only got 87% of the vote, which, when you consider that he essentially runs a totalitarian democracy, somewhere in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is looking at Putin's election results and calling him a lightweight, calling him a loser. He's probably on the phone to him now laughing at the fact that you only got 87% of the vote. Call yourself a dictator. I got 104% of the vote at the last North Korean election, Kim Jong-un might well be saying. And I mean, there were ostensibly some opposition politicians, but you'll remember that the most prominent opposition politician has recently been murdered by Putin's goons. So the entire conversation in many ways is ridiculous. I speak, of course, of Alexei Navalny, whose widow, Yulia, was at the Berlin embassy, Russia's embassy in Berlin, for protests alongside a lot of other Russian expats. And I found myself wondering, as a consequence, oddly, of Grant Shapps' comments, I found myself wondering about other totalitarian dictatorships that have unfolded on our watch, you know, within living memory, within a sort of comparative historical framework. And I found myself wondering what normal people knew of the regime. Because you have huge numbers of people trying to protest on the streets of other European countries. As I say, Yulia Navalny was in Berlin. The London embassy had a similar protest. The Russian embassy in London had a similar protest outside it. One journalist described a 15-minute walk from the beginning of the queue to the end of it. So hard to put numbers on it. But the sense outside the country is that everyone sees Vladimir Putin very clearly for what he is. But inside the country, I don't know. I've spent a lot of time in Greece. It's hard to believe that the Greece that I know and love was a military junta at a time when many of the people I know and love in Greece were alive. Franco was in Spain. You have, obviously, Stalin and Hitler straddling 20th century history like vile colossi. How much and I don't want to talk about the average Russian, because there's no such thing as an average Russian. There's about 7 time zones. God knows how many ethnicities. conflicting historical narrative. I mean, but people in Russia, what do they know about Vladimir Putin? What do they know about how hard is it for somebody inside Russia to get a clearer picture of what Russia looks like, or what Vladimir Putin looks like from the outside? That's what I'm really interested in. I want to know how complete the propaganda system is. You know that support for the attack upon Ukraine was quite high. So they clearly believe things that we are not properly understanding on this side of the world. The almost the impossibility of understanding how a Russian can look at Vladimir Putin and feel anything but what we feel when we look at, and this is where Grant Shapps' comments become quite pertinent, when we look at a Joseph Stalin or even an Adolf Hitler. He's written Adolf Hitler. He's written an article for The Telegraph in which he accuses Putin of having stolen the Russian election, having had Alexei Navalny imprisoned or murdered. He probably could have gone a little bit further. He cites the exit poll that has Putin on 80% of the vote with a turnout in excess of 70%. And it just occurred to me that inside Russia, you have no way of knowing how much of this is true. We can poo-poo it as much as we want. We can mock it, we can laugh, but we can't know. And that's really what I want you to tell me. You can't really travel to Russia much at the moment since the invasion of Ukraine. The double standards that the West have, don't waste 10pence ringing up to tell me how awful the West is. I appreciate that, but it's not the conversation that we're having today. And quite a good example of the double standards would be the failure properly to respond to the invasion of Crimea, because it was done and dusted so quickly that we barely bothered with a diplomatic response when David Cameron was Prime Minister. It's only because Zelensky and the Ukrainian people took Putin by surprise with both the scale and the strength of their resistance that the West had to actually get behind them and impose the sort of sanctions that mean it is very difficult to travel to Russia these days. But there'll be people here who've spent time in Russia. Dominic Cummings springs to mind. There'll be plenty of people who love Russia in the way that I love Greece. You know, you can love the literature, you can love the history, the music. I'm possibly too big a country to be talked about in the same way that we talk about other countries, because it has so many different and disparate strands. But what is it like for a normal Russian, if we can conceive of such a thing? What does a normal Russian know about Vladimir Putin? I don't even know how widespread dissidence is, how widespread defiance is. I don't know how many people, this is the thing, isn't it? I don't know how many people are passionately opposed to Vladimir Putin's rule, but silently so, because they lack the... I don't want to say courage, because that wouldn't be fair, although it correctly describes Alexei Navalny and my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has become the most prominent opposition politician in Russia since Alexei's death. And these are incredible men, one of whom I know quite well. And I don't know how widely supported their positions are inside Russia. I know that they're supported, but I genuinely don't know whether or not Putin is sort of hanging on through tyranny and fear by his fingertips, or whether he's actually incredibly popular because people don't know the reality of what he represents and what he does, and or they don't know the reality of how he looks to the rest of the world. So that's what I want you to try to help me with now. As someone who knows a little bit more than I do about modern Russia, what's the average experience of a Russian person with regard to what happens in their country? Because you've got a relatively idiotic British politician accidentally saying something quite accurate. Grant Shapps, Secretary of State for Defence, describing Vladimir Putin as a modern-day Stalin, which is shorthand for a murder, for an awful genocidal dictator. And no one really in this country is going to balk at that. No one sensible in this country is going to accuse Shapps of hyperbole or of going too far or even of undiplomatic language. Most of us are just going to nod along with the description of Vladimir Putin, arguably the most powerful person in the world, certainly in the top three, to paraphrase Brian Clough, as a modern-day Stalin. It's shorthand for absolutely awful. That's what it translates as. It translates as he is absolutely awful. He is historically awful. He is of such awful significance that he stands comparison with some of the most awful figures in recent history. And we all sit here going, yep, he's right on that. No, I've got no beef with that. That seems perfectly reasonable. How would a normal Russian respond to that comparison? How well informed is a normal Russian on that question, on that reality, in order for us to have some idea of how they would respond to that description? So what does the average Russian know about Russia? And I have nothing else to add to this because I have no answers to these questions. The only Russians I know are sworn enemies of Vladimir Putin who live in daily fear of death or attack while living on this side of the world. And I guess Evgenia Kara-Murza most recently sitting in this studio conveying precisely what that involves and what that means. So what would you, if we were living in Russia now, there's the question. If we were living in Russia now, what would we think about Vladimir Putin? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. If we were living in Russia now, what would we know? Okay? And I can promise you now, if you hit the numbers, you will get through. I can't imagine that this is a question that everybody listening is qualified to answer, because I'm certainly not. But if we were living in Russia now, what would we know? 0345 6060 973. It is 18 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And I suppose what interests me is Richard reminds us Stalin was voted the third greatest Russian of all time in a poll there not long ago. So when Grant Shapps says Putin is so awful, he's as bad as Stalin, we all go, whoa, that's pretty bad. What do Russians do? How do Russians go? And I fully acknowledge that there are elements of this question that are a tiny bit silly. I mentioned the number of time zones. I think I underestimated it. Mike says there are 11 time zones, James. My ex-family lives in Magnitogorsk, and there's not a lot of world news there. They will know whatever they are told. St. Petersburg might be a different kettle of fish. And this from Des. I have many friends and relatives in Russia. Putin is overwhelmingly popular amongst, quotes, ordinary, end quotes, Russians, rightly or wrongly. And the war in Ukraine is generally supported, albeit grudgingly. The Russians have a clear understanding of their history of invasion from the West and want a strong man to represent and protect them. So I can get my head around that, but I can't quite see how you sustain it in the modern universe where information is everywhere and control is harder than ever. Sharon is in Brighton. Sharon, what can you tell us?
James,
hello.
I'm delighted to speak to you, first-time caller.
Welcome.
I've been when I was 16. I'm 67 now. When I was 16, I went to Russia all alone.
Gosh, really?
I know it seems like a.
Are you a spy? Are you a spy? Are you a spy? Are you a spy? Are you a member of the security services?
Yeah, I was a very young spy at 16.
Yes,
I went mostly to have my knickers stolen at the time that I went, because apparently there was a very great shortage of modern knickers. But anyway, to cut to the chase, James.
Yes.
While I was there. I was there for about 3 weeks and travelled into different parts because, of course, it was very closely monitored where you went. But I met with a wonderful young woman who was just 5 years older than me.
Right.
And she was a student of English, but, I mean, she was such a fantastic student of English. She even learnt Chaucer and stuff like that,
Good Lord.
So she was really, really top-notch.
Yes.
She went on to become a professor of economics who was able to teach in both English and Russian in her home city of Krasnodar, which is in the south of Russia.
Yes.
And we've been corresponding ever since. And, of course, now, would you believe we are still able to speak regularly on WhatsApp.
Gosh.
So I spoke to her 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that's our most recent call. But for a while, when the Ukraine war started, we sort of skirted around the issue a bit because we always had a very similar liberal political point of view.
Yes.
And I assumed that because she's highly intelligent, so is her husband, I assumed that would, permeate into what was happening at the time. So I was absolutely devastated when we decided that we would have to grasp the nettle,
yes.
that she was fully in support of Putin, which she had never been before, never. So that was a real shock to me. And basically, I think in her case, some of her support for Putin is based on historical elements. For example, her grandmother came from the Donbass region of Ukraine, and I think there is definitely an element of that permeates. But also, up until very recently, I thought she was being able to access a very broad spectrum of media coverage from Europe and from us in particular, because she's a real Anglophile and she loves to know everything about English art and music and poetry, literature, everything like that. So I was pretty horrified to find out only 2 weeks ago when we had a 2-hour chat on WhatsApp that she gets most of her information from the Farage channel. What's it called? GB.
Oh, GB News is doing. You can pick it up in Russia, can you?
Yes. Well, she's obviously able to pick it up, and so I had to put her straight on that and say to her that actually no right-thinking member of anybody, any family or.
But what an interesting picture of Britain you'd get if that was your.
Exactly.
What would somebody like her then think of the Stalin comparison? If so, the Secretary of State for Defence, you don't need to reflect upon the fact that it's a relatively foolish man who holds that position at the moment. It's still a high status role, and therefore, when he speaks, we listen. And he compares Putin to Stalin. How would that go down with your friend?
Well, I think now, I think it would. She'd be really wounded by that. But you see, I think if we had been talking about it 5 years ago, she probably would have agreed with me.
Gosh. So what we underestimate, and possibly what underpins this entire conversation, is Putin's really good at what Putin does, isn't he? He doesn't make these decisions on a whim, and he knows that he will fire up the sort of fervour you describe your friend as having as a consequence of his decision to go into Ukraine.
Absolutely, and she was so determined to try and show me another side of Putin that she forwarded me this interview, in inverted commas, because it wasn't really an interview, because there were very few questions. It was just being talked at from this Tucker Carlson, this American media guy that works for Fox News.
He did work for Fox, and he went out there recently to interview Putin.
So this is the 1.5 hour interview. So I worked my way through it slowly, and I have to say that Putin didn't come across as the sort of drugged, dopey.
No.
He didn't come across like that. But the whole tenet of his speech, because it wasn't an interview. He was just talking at this guy and allowed him to intersperse it with a few questions. But it was all to do with history and going back to the year 816 and what was happening then, and all the land claims, and this very, very involved sort of historical.
We haven't got a clue about that. We can. Have we here? You clearly do. But with the idea that is what motivates.
I know, but as I said, because I spread that, I forwarded that to a lot of my friends and family, and I said, going on that example, we probably should be looking to be back under the directorship of Norway and Denmark.
Yeah, it would be Harold Godwinson. It all started going wrong with the Normans, didn't it, Sharon?
Exactly.
That's the point. And that is, that is a heady brew. That appeals to people. It's a similar form, I suppose, of rhetoric, to making meaningless comments about wanting your country back, but Putin backs it up with over 1,000 years of history, and therefore the reaction of a highly educated, highly articulate, highly intelligent woman like Sharon's friend becomes slightly less baffling, but no less shocking to Sharon, most obviously, but also to me, also to us. And again, you think about what Donald Trump represents. Talking this weekend about a bloodbath in the event of him not winning. If I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. It was in the middle of a speech about threats to the US car industry. So, and he has enormous support. I find support for Donald Trump impossible to understand. So why should I be shocked to find support for Vladimir Putin impossible to understand? Thank you, Sharon. What a sparkling debut. Alex is in Moscow, appropriately enough. Alex, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
long-time listener, first-time caller. So
well, obviously I've edited today's programme entirely for your personal bespoke enjoyment, Alex. What do you want to say?
Thank you. Finally, a topic I can contribute. I've been waiting for a long time. Just to say, I mean, obviously it's hard to. We don't have very accurate polling in the country to say, what the feeling is. So I can only say what I see.
Yes, around you.
Around me from out the window in Moscow, my flat, and I'd say generally, I told your producer that if we talk about demographically, who's against Putin, the younger people are still very much so. I mean, we saw it during the funeral of Navalny last week. I think that there were a lot of younger people there, and to be fair, when Navalny was out of jail, when he was still alive, he was very good at getting that audience through YouTube. He had a YouTube channel. He was very successful. Yes. But to be honest, that's actually one of the things that Putin supporters and Navalny enemies would say, that, they're just young, they're stupid. That's why they support him. They don't know what it was like. And actually, one of the, I guess, generally what I'll say, people, and I think to bring back to your point about, what were people like in fascist Greece or fascist Spain? Yes. I think most people, they just want to live their life, no matter where they are, because they have that family, they have their jobs. And, it seems to me that it's very similar here. People, again, a lot of them very apolitical, and they just live their life. And obviously, since the war started, things have gotten very difficult. Prices changed, went up, and, people who got used to traveling to Europe, for example, they can't do that anymore, and things like that. But people just want to continue to live. And
that's what I wanted to say. I meant to address that in my introduction. That's what it struck me as, is that if most of us are not Alexei Navalny or Vladimir Karamurza, we are too busy getting on with it, too busy trying to live as normal a life as possible, regardless of what regime we're living under. And that will be a common Russian experience. You've mentioned the generational divide. What about the geographical one, the city versus the country, or the idea that the less people around you are dissenting from the government line, the less likely you are to have particular problems with the regime?
Well, I mean, as far as when we had protests in the past, obviously the major ones were in the cities, and I think even when the war started, where we had a lot of people coming out, that was again only in major cities. I think same in the country, people again would just want to continue. And in terms of actually information, how we can access it, it's not like we don't have a blanket. Sure. Obviously, you turn on the TV, you see the propaganda, but then there's Telegram channels, people using VPN services, to get access to.
But that's people who want it, though, isn't it? It's almost like the appetite becomes self-fulfilling. I want the truth, or I want a broader array of information. I want something that goes beyond the state-sanctioned propaganda. But a lot of people won't. A lot of people will not have that appetite, and they will be the ones that you describe as just sort of getting on with their lives. What do you think? Because you clearly lived here. You've clearly your English is. You clearly haven't spent your whole life in Russia. What would shock me the most? Like if you said to me, "Oh, I'll tell you what you'd find really shocking. I know this bloke who believes," or the best evidence of the disconnect that I've tried to describe today between what an ordinary Russian may just consider to be true, that we here in the West would find almost unbelievable. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I see what you mean, but honestly, I've been watching. I mean, just to take, so for example, if you came to Russia, and I can find you plenty of, true believers as well.
Yes.
And in my age group, and definitely, and older people, I find plenty of believers and people who believe in this war think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if you try to talk, I might be personally, you'd probably be shocked if you try to talk to those kind of people,
right?
About Bucha, about other atrocities, and they'll tell you it's all fake news, and
I see.
It was all made up by Ukraine or things of that nature. I feel like that might.
Yeah. So
but
because we live in a world of information overload, but people can still essentially, and this isn't confined to Russians by any stretch of the imagination. I've got Jean in Warrington here texting me about European farmers protesting and claiming it's censorship that I'm not talking about it more, which is, bless his little cotton socks, it's bonkers, but you can be in Warrington and believe whatever you want to believe. You don't have to be in Moscow. It's in some ways a malaise of our age. Alex, thank you. 11:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 11:36 is the time. Joe writes, this weekend I met a Russian lady, youngish, married to an Englishman, living here, fully supportive of Putin, saying how much he had done to improve people's lives and how popular he is. She said she would vote for him if she lived there. I was speechless. She obviously sees and hears all of our own media reports and still holds that position. So you'd have thought, wouldn't you, off the top of your head, you'd have thought the Skripals, the attempted murder of the Skripals, which of course did see a British woman called Dawn Sturgis killed as a consequence of that botched assassination attempt. And then latterly the imprisonment and almost certain murder of Alexei Navalny in a Russian jail. You sit here in the West and think, well, they are absolutely incontrovertible evidence that Putin is a murderous thug, a murderous dictator. So the confusion is how anyone could arrive at different conclusions when they're in possession of the same facts, which makes, of course, somebody living here arriving at those positions even more baffling than it would be for someone living in Russia. Interesting, really, that Sharon mentioned the television channel that she mentioned. I get a little bit confused as to which one is which, but I think the Rupert Murdoch one is winding down now. So GBB's is the one that Farage is on. They've just had 5 complaints upheld by Ofcom, the broadcasting watchdog, for bias, for failure of impartiality. But hello, the Pope's a Catholic and bears go to the toilet in the woods. But the idea that there are people in Russia watching that and thinking that it's representative of the UK is kind of hilarious and chilling at the same time, isn't it? It makes you perhaps come to a slightly better understanding of why anyone would be hemorrhaging tens of millions of pounds to keep such an odd operation alive. Back to this question of what Putin looks like in Russia as opposed to over here, because we know what he looks like from here. What does he look like there? Arben is in Wood Green. Arben, what can you tell us?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks for having me. I'm deliriously grateful for talking to you. James, I'm originally from Albania. I've been living in London for 30 years. I went to Russia before the pandemics, and I was so curious to see how that universe reacts. Coming from a country where we were the North Korea of Europe until 3 decades ago,
of course,
I found so many similarities. And by the way, I wish you go to Albania and love it as more as Greece.
I would love to do that. I shall do one day, I think.
It's very cheap flights. 30 pounds
Sold. Go on, what were the parallels you saw?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I thought I was reliving Albania during communism. You see people on undergrounds there in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, with all due respect, but, they look to me like bitten canines, people who couldn't even look in your eyes. Even the navigation system was totally different from the one we use in the West. The news channels, they were starting with Putin reports and ending with Putin. And I wonder whether the seeds of democracy in that kind of land will be able to flourish. It's a totally different universe, because even during the Tsar times, and then Stalin's coming, and Lenin and Stalin, and they haven't seen any years, or they haven't lived democracy as such as we used to live. And now Putin, and to some respect, it's the fault of the West, because you remember during the late 90s where Yeltsin was very weak and the Russian bear was so weak, the West, instead of killing it off, they took him to the veterinary clinic, and that's why Putin is where he is. Plus, psychologically, this kind of societies, when you when you see some kind of economic prosperity, they never think of any distracting the structural the structures that they have created. They live with that. Plus nationalism also, plus propaganda. Even the Russians who you see abroad, for example, if you go to Dubai or if you go to Antalya or Sharm el-Sheikh,
Sri Lanka increasingly, I'm being told as well.
Yeah, but these are not proper democracies, and they are there for a very short period of time just to enjoy, and they don't see the benefits of living in a democracy.
To stay in also they'll be, by definition, they'll be very wealthy people. So how did they keep a lid on it in Albania when you were growing up? Well, because it's quite hard on the outside looking in not to think that, crikey, everybody is either deluded or dangerous or. But I mean, how do you keep a lid on it?
The society was totally brainwashed.
Right.
We didn't know different.
Yes.
While in today's Russia, it's totally different because you've got a small window open to see the West, but in Albania at the time, you mentioned Kim Jong-un.
Yes.
With 104%. In Albania, it was.
I made that up, just to be clear. I made that up. I think he got 99.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. In Albania, we were, like I said, the North Korea of Europe. We couldn't.
We just don't know. So we're sitting here. In a way, my question is false, isn't it? I'm asking a question based upon what I know to be true, or what I just take for granted. Whereas you're describing societies in which you can't even begin to ask the questions in the context that I'm asking them, because all the stuff that you take for granted doesn't exist.
And absolutely, and I'm so sorry. When you think of Russia, a human contribution to mankind, so many. Shostakovich, writers, astronauts, and all these people, who are the pride of humanity, coming from that part of the world or universe, and then you see today's Russia, with Putin. I was shocked with the comparison with Stalin. Of course, Stalin was a dictator, but Putin, he cannot be compared to Stalin just because of the wealth.
No, of course. The theft.
And the power he's got.
Well, how many people in Russia would be aware of that? Because I know that some of Navalny's and Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat, has tweeted something very powerful this morning, last night actually. Putin was so scared of Navalny, he had to make sure he was dead before he was brave enough to say his name in public. And it's another example of something that seems obvious and powerful over here, but in Russia it wouldn't resonate at all because you don't have the parameters or the vocabulary of understanding. But what would the average Russian's perception of Putin's private wealth be? Would they be aware of it? Because Navalny's footage from that mansion, that incredible mansion, was one of the things that brought him to prominence, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but maybe people in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. When I was traveling by train from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and I was seeing all these small villages and small towns, who were, oh my God, it reminded me of Albania all the time. But I don't think these people, let alone geographically further east, because when you fly, I've been flying so many times to China and Japan recently. It's 6 hours by plane from Poland to go to Mongolia or the other side. I mean, all these cities, were so isolated. Can you believe it? Can you believe it that they will have the proper information that we have in the West about Putin? They seem like a figure, because they don't know different. They're happy with the economic prosperity, the money they're getting from gas and oil, and for them it's better than they have ever been. They don't care about politics. Plus, do you believe that Putin will allow democracy in terms of control of voting system and all this stuff? 10 people or 100 people protest in Moscow and they're rounded up within seconds. Can you believe it further down in Novosibirsk or somewhere further down east? It's unbelievable. That's why I feel so sorry.
Of course. That comes across. And it's why, I in some ways, even the concept of an ordinary or an average Russian is unhelpful. But the relationship between information and humanity is at the heart of this conversation, Ab, and I'm glad you were listening today in a position, such a strong position to help. And journalistically, if that's the right word to use, you start with presumptions that shouldn't be in place. You start with presumptions that apply. You presume that you're comparing two kind of concepts that share common commonalities, and you're not. You cannot begin to imagine what it would have been like to have spent your entire life in Russia, and then to ask, well, what do you think about Vladimir Putin from a Western perspective? I was just sort of nudging ever closer, thanks to callers like Abbot and others, to the idea of almost parallel universes, I suppose, is a slightly lazy phrase I'm looking for. It's 10 to 12. David Cameron describes it, or says this is not what fair and free or free and fair elections look like. President Zelensky in Ukraine. There is no evil Putin would not do to maintain his personal power. And it just occurred to me this morning, and thanks largely to the quality of the calls coming in, I think this has been justified as an inquiry. It just occurred to me that we have no idea how the same stories appear in Russia. We only know how they appear to us, and that's why I opened with slightly silly comments about North Korea, and getting 104% support in an election, and Kim Jong-un laughing at Vladimir Putin for only managing to secure 87.8% of the vote, albeit that's the highest in post-Soviet history. And we find it ridiculous, and we know that there were no rivals, no meaningful rivals were allowed to stand against him. We know that he kills his enemies. We know that he kills dissidents in this country. And yet, it's not helpful to understanding how this can happen to completely gloss over the reality of what it would like to be there. I'm a bit clearer now. No, I'm no more cheerful about it. And I suppose the killer question, if you pardon the pun, is what on earth happens when Putin's not here anymore? I mean, his grip, we've spoken of Russian leaders for as long as I've been alive, but there's always been quite a turnover. Khrushchev, Gorbachev, Andropov, Brezhnev. But Putin's been there forever. He's changed the rules so that he could stay there forever. That's where the parallel with Stalin, perhaps, is at its most pertinent, that Grant Shapps has made, because it's almost impossible to separate modern Russia from Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin from modern Russia. So what happens when he's not there anymore? I don't know, but I do know that it's a question that, I presume it's a question that democracies around the world are already fretting over. Simon's in St. Neots. Simon, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I'm cursed, as I suspect you are, with this desire to always hear the other side of the story, even if I don't agree with it.
Up to a point, Lord Copper.
Up to a point.
Yes.
Well, specifically, I find it's interesting to listen to another perspective when I don't particularly agree with it. And I'm fortunate enough to have had now, coming up for nearly 2 years, a Ukrainian person staying with me.
Okay.
And she is understandably, inverted commas, anti-Russian.
Yes. And
when we were watching the TV together, I was saying, well, what do you think, though, the people of Russia think? Well, I think it's terrible, Simon. That I wasn't asking you to say, what do you think they think?
Yeah.
And she said, well, I'm not sure, but I do know somebody in Russia, in Moscow, and if you would like, I can arrange for you to speak with that person.
Right.
Which I thought was very exciting. So she arranged for me to speak with this person. I was told, I don't know whether this was being overly sensitive, but I was told not to mention Putin's name, not to mention the war, not because people might be listening, etc., etc. Yeah. And I spoke to this young man, and this was his take on it. He said that predominantly, and he may be stereotyping, I don't know, but he said predominantly older people, sort of over 50, they were predominantly in favour of what was happening because they saw it as a return to their lands. Also, these people only, perhaps not exclusively, but virtually exclusively, would listen to the government propaganda from the government and would take their lead from that. But he did say to me that people under 40 do have access to Western news, and that predominantly the people that he knew, and he might only be associating himself with people that agree with him, I don't know, that they predominantly thought it was absolutely wrong and were very anti-Putin. And so that was my experience that I had speaking to somebody, and this was about 6 months ago.
I wonder whether they change as they get older.
Perhaps they do.
Because we do. I mean, you look in this country and you're supposed to get more right-wing as you get older, but I'm 52 and I still find that appeal to, some mythical Britain of years past that has somehow been stolen from us by events and modernity. I find it absolutely ridiculous, but we know that it's intoxicating for some people, for certain types of voters. So maybe that's just the the watered down British version of what you've just described in Russia.
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, don't judge me with this. Please be gentle with me. But I am. I'm 63 and a Conservative voting Brexiteer. Please be gentle with me, James.
I don't have to beat you up. You punch yourself in the face on a regular basis, Simon.
I know. And I've really enjoyed going on the journey with you as you've made me confront some of the issues.
I mean that's as long as we keep it friendly, then we can learn from each other, just as you learnt from your newish friend in Russia. But I think that that brand of nationalism is absolutely fascinating. I really do, and it explains a lot of the things that you can't understand, or a lot of the things I can't understand. Are often down to trying to apply a kind of intellectual analysis to an emotional situation. And I don't know why you voted for Brexit, but most people I speak to who seem perfectly pleasant often thought that they were voting for something intangible rather than something tangible. So when you say what laws are we going to get rid of or what benefits are going to be there, you're kind of having two conflicting conversations. And that idea of the country being diminished and it can only be restored to its natural greatness, that's not a uniquely Russian offer that Putin is making. You get that absolutely everywhere. Thank you, Simon. Take care. Last word on this, I think, to Gary, who's in Calais. Gary, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Great show as normal.
You're very kind.
Right, I was in Russia. Well done, sir. I used to visit Russia quite a lot as a tour guide, worked out there, down in the Ukraine, the Crimea, actually.
Oh, yeah.
But in Oh, yeah, it's fantastic. And you really get to know the Russians and the locals, and they are different. They're all barking mad anyway. But we was at the reenactment of the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Borodino, which was a big battle fought in 1812, where the French are invading Russia and heading for Moscow. So they did a big reenactment, big celebration. Putin was going to be, was there eventually being the word. And there was people from Russia, from Austria, from other former Soviet countries, France, of course, big contingent as well. Thousands of reenactors reenacting this battle, like the Waterloo 2015 thing.
Wow.
So Putin turns up 3 hours late. Yeah,
right.
3 hours late, kept everybody waiting. There was heat wave on. All these thousands of guys dressed in Napoleonic kit.
Oh, Lord.
Tens of thousands of people watching.
Yeah.
Reenactors falling over, fainting.
All waiting on him.
All waiting on Putin, fainting, heart attacks, fleet of ambulances heading back to Moscow.
Yeah.
And he turns up 3.5 hours late.
Go on.
His military helicopter lands. He walks straight into the tent where the vodka and the caviar is.
Nice.
And I'm saying to the Russian guys, oh, my God, you're going to complain about this. And they said, that is Putin. That is Putin. He doesn't care what the West say. Look at him.
Well, he doesn't care what they say either. So he's just got a kind of mythical status then among the kind of. What sort of tours were you doing then, Gary? What were you? Who were your clients?
Well, they could actually be British military.
Okay.
When we did the Crimea, which was coming up for the 150th anniversary. It could be people there was this golden period where you could visit places in the Crimea.
Right.
Chartered Light Brigade, Battle of the Alma, that sort of thing. And you got to see that change, which was quite frightening, where you could see it changing on a sixpence.
Well,
there was a group called Russia House that were doing demonstrations. And you talked to them. We were there when the Moscow siege was on in the theatre.
Yes.
They showed that live on telly. You saw the Russian special forces rush in. Half of them headed for the bar and started drinking the drinks that were being left on the counter.
So you're a sort of military historian then?
Absolutely professional now.
I love it. What do you do now
instead?
Where do you go instead now? What sort of tours do you do instead of that?
Instead of that, we do
France mostly, is it? Yeah.
Belgium, Spain, that sort of thing. Bit of Germany, bit of Holland. Living in Calais, where I do, of course, we're smothered in it. So that's what people come and do. But But the Russian thing, there was this golden opportunity, a period where you could go and explore all those battles, all finished now. But you did get to see the off-roads of Russia. You went off piece, so to speak.
Yes.
So you started to see the everyday Russian.
Get a better
you saw their
handle.
attitudes as
Yes.
well. Very much so.
Well, that's history as well, isn't it? Trying to get the testimony of ordinary people as opposed to the military and political leaders is a relatively recent development in the context of history, but obviously a crucial one. Gary, thank you, mate. I enjoyed that. It's just gone 12 noon. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. A bit of a different one now, a slight change of direction, it is, I'm afraid, going to involve me mentioning my last book, not the one that's out at the moment, but the one before. Which I'll give you a bit of advice if you're ever thinking of writing a book. Don't publish it during lockdown. Don't publish a book when all the bookshops are shut. Are you writing this down? This is top advice, this. But I tried in that book called How Not to Be Wrong to explore the impact that public school education, public schools culture had on our leadership. I mean, the central thesis of the book was that we couldn't have had worse people in charge for something like the pandemic than people who'd been to schools like mine, where you're taught to ignore vulnerability and fragility, to ignore your own feelings, where they mistake repression with resilience. And Boris Johnson, probably the finest living example of what happens when you accept that invitation to construct an entirely fake personality that thrives and flourishes in those contexts. And I mention that because I, of all people, he's not someone I know a great deal about, except, of course, that his late sister Diana was the Princess of Wales. But Charles Spencer who's much more privileged than me, obviously, but he has explored similar theories in a new memoir about his schooling. It's called A Very Private School, and he describes the public school culture in a very similar way to the conclusions that I arrived at politically about the kind of character that is created in those schools and the kind of world in which that character thrives. We may get onto an element of that a little later in this hour, but it's not the first point of interest. The first point of interest is his quite controversial contention that boarding schools are devastating for society. He goes on to say, you extrapolate from that experience and think of the damage that it's done to other people who have ended up in powerful positions. You see, it's sympathetic. It sometimes doesn't sound sympathetic when I talk about Boris Johnson, but these broken children who've become like fake men, a huge part, I think, of the British condition at the moment. And Spencer says, I'm talking over the centuries, not just contemporaries. They have to have had their view of what's acceptable behaviour, what other people mean in terms of empathy. They have to have been brutalised. And I cannot think that all of the effects of these schools can have been good for society or for the empire or whatever we were in control of at the time. I think it's been devastating in some ways. It's a fascinating theory because it's so unfashionable. It's becoming a little bit more fashionable. But it's about looking at the underbelly of people who on paper are enormous successes. You know, prime ministers, generals, people who would march off to other corners of the world to take control and to rule. And these were qualities that we encouraged and admired. This is what we wanted to be like. And then by the time you get to the back end of the 20th century, the new middle class was sending its sons to these schools because the advantage that these schools bestowed was enormous. But when you stop and think about it, which we're going to do now, even without the casual brutality and, in many cases, the child sex abuse, the criminality that was in place. And Charles Spencer writes of a female teacher who was abusing boys at his prep school. The prep school is the one you go to from 7 to 13, and then from 13 to 18 you go to public school. And he also talks about vicious beatings, the spikes of a cricket boot by the school's Latin master. Anybody over 50 has got stories like this. Absolutely anybody who went to a school like ours and is over 50 has got stories like this. If you're lucky, you won't have been on the receiving end of it. For me, the physical abuse, as in the beatings, sometimes sanctioned and formal, sometimes not sanctioned and not formal, nowhere near as awful as some of the things that were happening to my friends in a child sex abuse context. But it's not a competition. You spend years going, well, I got off lucky, I got off lightly. You didn't get off lightly. This is why Charles Spencer's book is so interesting. You didn't get off lightly. You were brutalised. You had an absolutely terrible time. Just because someone over there had an even worse time doesn't make you lucky. It just makes you unlucky on a slightly different scale to where he was. But what I want you to talk to me about, either as someone who went to boarding school, or do you know what might be even more interesting? Someone who loves someone who went to boarding school. When he talks about that absence of empathy, I would say there's an emotional unavailability. I was quite blessed personally in this field because my mum was so emotionally literate that even when I was away at school, I never lost sight of my inner life. But the encouragement to lose sight of it is almost irresistible, to sort of stop. If you can't talk about your own feelings, how can you possibly care for anybody else's? And if you've been raised to believe, almost like a PE teacher's approach to pain. I've told you a few times I had a PE teacher who would shout on the rugby pitch, "It's only pain, O'Brien, it doesn't really hurt." And you'd have some kid with a broken collarbone hobbling around the back of the scrum. "Oh, come on, get stuck in." And you think that that's nice and normal, but what it actually creates, I think, is a kind of, well, there's so many books that have been written about boarding school syndrome now. Sad Little Men is one of them. There are lots of others that I'll remind you of in the course of this hour. But they're all written from the perspective of being one of the boys, of being one of the victims, of being one of the pupils. I wonder what it's like to see the person that you love in this kind of space and to know that they can't really help this survivor personality that they've got. They can't really help what it is that they've become in order to survive in that environment. That's not the most irresistible invitation I've ever offered you, and don't worry, there will be others. But if you want to get stuck into that, how would you describe the damage that boarding school does as an observer rather than a victim? 0345 6060 973. All right, that's question number one. You're an observer. You're talking about your husband, possibly your wife, your friend, your brother, your partner. How would you describe the damage that boarding school does? Not to society, which is what Earl Spencer is talking about, but to, because the one follows from the other. It does damage to the boys, and then the boys damage society. Therefore, it is the boarding school and the culture, particularly the top rank public schools, that do the damage to society. And then the slightly trickier job of describing the damage that it's done to you. Because what we are encouraged to do when we attend schools like this is almost the perfect storm of self-denial. So by not being very empathetic, by not being encouraged to talk about your own feelings, by not acknowledging pain and vulnerability and fragility, you become, in a sense, the last person on earth who's going to talk about the damage that's been done to you by boarding school, because you spent your whole life denying it. I mean, literally talking about it hasn't done me any harm. That's a chapter heading. It hasn't done me any harm. What do you think the stiff upper lip is? Just because that's a phrase you've heard before, right? 3 words. How many times have you heard that in your life? My generation, probably a little bit more often than if you're younger than me. But even if you're younger than me, you've heard that phrase, stiff upper lip. You've heard it all your life. And it's been presented to you as 2 things. Number one, as a massive good. It's a good thing to have a stiff upper lip, right? It's a brilliant thing to have a stiff upper lip. You must have a stiff upper lip. And what else has it been presented you to as? British. It's a peculiarly British thing, right? Johnny Foreigner doesn't have a stiff upper lip. Johnny Foreigner doesn't have a stiff. It's a British thing, and it's a public school thing. So it's a British, or particularly an English public school thing. It's a brilliant thing to have, a stiff upper lip, and it's a very British, if not English, attribute to be celebrated. That's why we rule the waves, because of our stiff upper lips. Now, what does it mean? What does stiff upper lip mean? What does it mean? Yeah, it means you're repressed. It means that you deny pain. It means that you run away from self-knowledge, that you prioritize resilience or robustness over emotional literacy and honesty. It means that you're living your life in a state of complete denial, and the denial is both conscious and subconscious. The conscious bit is tamping it down, talking about stiff upper lips, claiming that it didn't do me any harm. But the unconscious bit is the belief, for example, that you can wrestle your way out of any problem, that if you live your life with your fists up, then no one can ever hurt you. You can never be hurt. And this can propel people all the way into Downing Street. The number you need to join this conversation is 0345 6060973. What damage did it do to you? What damage did it do to someone that you love? And then finally, the notion that it didn't do you any harm, I want to explore a bit as well. I've told you this, I think, that the almost disbelief I feel when I look back on who I was, even in my 20s, when I first started appearing on television, I would often do debates, and corporal punishment was still quite a big thing. I remember sitting in studios. And this is the point I want you to understand. I wasn't doing it for effect. I wasn't doing it because no one else was prepared to argue that point. On corporal punishment in particular, I honestly believed that it hadn't done me any harm, and therefore there was still room for it in the schooling environment. So I would sit in a studio in Norwich, looking the audience squarely in the eye and telling them that beating children was a good thing, not only for the children themselves, but also for the school or the society in general. The reason why I knew that beating children was a good thing was because of the effort that I had put into persuading myself that it hadn't hurt me. This is the best way I can explain it. I had worked from the age of 10 incredibly hard inside myself, secretly if you like, subconsciously, to persuade myself that I wasn't in pain. When that 6'3" man brought his specially designed weapon down upon my little hands with as much force as he could humanly muster, I was not hurt. And the effort you put into convincing yourself that you are not hurt is immense, and it's all-encompassing. And you have absolutely no idea what you're doing to yourself or what you have done to yourself until, if you're lucky, you run up hard against it later in life and start unraveling the damage that was done to you in those early years. So that's what I mean. I can't put into words exactly what I'm describing, but I can tell you exactly what happened. 10-year-old boy, think how little that is. Think of a 10-year-old you know. How tiny is that? It doesn't matter how gobby you are, how obnoxious you are, how much you talk back, how rude or mischievous or naughty you are. That little boy there, no one should have been beating him up, either in a formal environment or an informal environment. But think about how hard he worked to convince himself that he wasn't in pain at all. Now people like Boris Johnson begin to make sense. Also had, obviously, a dysfunctional home life as well with a violent father. So you're putting yourself... It hasn't hurt me to see my father hit my mum. This is what you tell yourself when you're tiny. This is what we do. We convince ourselves that we're not hurting as much as we are because it works. And in that moment, you don't hurt as much. But then, of course, if you're lucky, you get to undo the damage. If you're not lucky, you go through life being unfaithful, being unkind, being unpleasant, being selfish, being thoughtless, being narcissistic. All of these things can happen. But it doesn't mean you were born that way. So the damage it can do, with the constant caveat that almost all of our parents sent us to these schools for the best and most pure of reasons. They honestly believed, with some justification, that they were buying us untold advantages that would set us in great stead for the rest of our lives. So it's not an act of abandonment, it's not an act of unpleasantness, but it is extraordinary, A, that we still do it, and B, that acknowledging the damage that it does is still so difficult to do in the public space. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. 18 minutes after 12. Because in a sense, that little bit there, that's my personal past, wasn't really about being at boarding school. It was about being beaten by adults as a child. But because you're at boarding school, and to survive in that context, you have to then do all of those little survival mechanisms that I described. And it means that many grown men in this country, particularly men over 50 who went to schools like mine, remain emotionally stunted. And that must be really tough to live with. It must be really tough to live with. If you've just recognised what I've described, and you've just almost like a little bell has gone off in your brain, I'd love to talk to you today. It's 12:19. 23 minutes after 12 is the time. The growing body of work looking at something called boarding school syndrome is fascinating. Alex Renton, a journalist, has written at great length about it from a very personal perspective as well. Two other authors you should be aware of. Richard Beard, whose book Sad Little Men looks at private schools and the ruin of England, and that, for me at least, the don in this field is a psychologist called Nick Duffell, Duffell, who's written a bunch of books in this field, the making of them and Wounded Leaders being perhaps the most pertinent, but trauma, abandonment and privilege as well. There's loads out there, and yet it's still denied. And we still live in a country where some of the worst victims of what we could call boarding school syndrome rise to some of the highest offices in the land. David Cameron is someone who fits into this category, but nobody, I don't think, fits it quite as completely as Boris Johnson. But let's bring it down to our level. How has it affected you? Or indeed someone you love? 24 after 12 is the time. Hamish is in Fife. Hamish, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I spent 8 years at boarding school from 10 to 18.
Yeah.
When we started, we were punch bags. I mean, we had old World War I beds, literally horsehair and straw mattresses. Yeah. And this is in the 70s. Teachers, whoever, if you ever listen to the lyrics of Pink Floyd's The Wall, it makes perfect sense to a boarder. Yes. They all say it. It just makes perfect sense. Now, in mid-50s, I end up helping support people who come to me because they know me, remember me from school, and they start talking about how difficult their lives have been.
Yes.
And you end up telling them to go and look at boarding school syndrome, and they sit there and go, oh, God, I'm not alone. And they look at it and understand it, that it's something that's affecting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. At least in Scotland, we have got the child abuse inquiry that has been leading to prosecutions and court cases ongoing. There's a chap called Giles Moffat who's been on TV recently. They've been going after a violent teacher from Edinburgh Academy.
Well, Nicky Campbell's played a big part in in a concurrent story as well. Although I think, and I mean, we talk about these matters and we will talk about them again, but I'm talking about more so, and I know you know this, but just for clarity, it's more the stuff that we thought was normal.
They normalised everything. They normalised beating. We had sexual predation normalised. You know, you just sat there and laughed off abusive teachers or teachers who spanked, boys.
And think of nicknames as probably the best example of what we knew was going on, but which we somehow persuaded ourselves wasn't harmful. I still meet people, Hamish. I think of one in particular, older than you, in his 60s, who was molested regularly by a Christian brother in Ireland and still claims that it hadn't done him any harm at all. Because that's the survival mechanism, isn't it? To tell yourself that it hasn't hurt you, you're not traumatized.
You lock it out.
Yeah.
You absolutely lock it out, and it comes back in your 50s for people. I have dealt with it after sort of my 30s when I've managed to get on top of it all.
Right.
But the number of people I know who are of my age that are horribly damaged.
Well, we don't talk about it, do we? Because to do so is under the rules under which we lived, to talk like this is to fail or to be a loser.
It's to be weak.
Yeah. Whereas in fact, the opposite, you know and I know, the opposite is true. This is strength. But the conditions we grew up in, to talk like this is to be weak.
Yeah, the strength was the Edinburgh Academy survivors who stood up at the child abuse inquiry in court, standing up to get that guy extradited from South Africa. Those people who stand up and fight, because the schools turn around and they will push everything out against you and find as much as they can to try and tie you with in a bad light.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of the institutional survival as well, in that you portray these people as being fragile, or as being failed, or as being undermining the school, undermining the system, undermining the institution, which is why, rightly or wrongly, somebody at the very pinnacle of our class hierarchy, like Charles Spencer, someone like him talking about this, carries more weight than people like us talking about it. There's also a class thing. You middle class kids couldn't really cope. You were never really going to run the empire. There's so much going on. I find it fascinating. Hamish, thank you. 28 after 12 is the time. Sally's in High Wycombe. Sally, what would you like to say?
Well, James, one of my reasons for phoning is because I am a woman or a girl or whatever you want to say. And very often, when you discuss this, the people who phone in are men, you refer to men, the books all refer to men,
they do.
Very rarely to women. And that was one of my main things. I just wanted it out there that there were a lot of women who also went to boarding school. And the whole... my parents went to boarding school.
Yes.
So there is a history of they lacked the ability to I was looked after, but not emotionally. And that was because I think they were sent away. Then I was sent away from a very young age. I went to a weekly board with my godparents. My parents sent me to private school from about 5. I can't remember exactly.
Good grief.
And then 11 went off to proper boarding school about 4 hours from home.
Yeah.
I wasn't abused, but the emotional trauma that's left me. I've spent quite a lot of years now in therapy looking after little Sally. And I've heard you talk about little James, and I realise that you've probably done something similar, to me.
Yes.
But I just find that there's this smiley Sally, and then there's the very sad, lost little Sally, and it's very hard to. I just don't feel completely alive. And when I said this to my therapist, funnily enough, last week, and then this morning when I was reading The Guardian, and I saw what. I'm just going to look what Spencer, whatever his name is. Is he Lord Spencer? Is he?
To you. Charles to you, Sally. Charles Spencer.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
It actually made me cry because he said it turns off this soft bit of you, and and I just feel like I've had a perfectly happy career, and I'm retired now, and I get on with things, but I know. Even now, just talking to you, I can feel this level of hidden underneath stuff and the pain and the sadness that's attached to that. And I think my school, I don't think was horrible in any way, but I don't think that was, nasty things going on.
But it's you see, do you know the phrase self-reliance?
Exactly.
That's a positive, right? We're supposed it's a good thing to be but it's not. It's not a good thing to be self-reliant. Not when you're little. It's good. It's nice to be looked after when you're little.
Well, that is the whole. I mean, a lot of what I've looked at is that you're meant to not have to learn to have to look after yourself. And the other thing I think I've become, and I don't know about others, is well, I don't know if I'm doing it so much now. A people pleaser. I will do things not just to please, but to try and do things right. To be good, if you like, that kind of
I went the other way.
Area.
I went the other way.
Bad.
No, I didn't go bad as such, but I went aggressive. So I could defend myself from the next attack, whether it was from a bigger boy or from a teacher. And for me, it was almost always teachers. I generally got on all right with older lads when I was little, but it means I was constantly ready to swing. So rather than being a people pleaser, I mean, I don't know if you listened to my show 20 years ago. If you think I'm aggressive and argumentative now, Sally, you wouldn't believe what I was like then. I'd tear people to shreds. I'd tear people to shreds for saying something completely innocuous, because the alternative would be to open myself up to the possibility of embarrassment or the possibility of pain or shame. So
shame has come up a lot, and I can't quite I sort of get my head around it. I know a lot of these words.
Yes.
But I can't quite get to it's very hard to sometimes link them with feelings.
Yes, and with experiences.
That's the big struggle.
Yes, well, you're doing the work, clearly. And can I ask why? Can I ask, was there something that prompted it? You don't have to answer this question. It's very nosy of me.
I worked in the mental health field for many years. I trained in I was a nurse. I trained in a hospital that was run on therapeutic community lines. And so I was always interested And I mean, okay, I was fulfilling a need I have learnt over the years.
Yes.
And so I worked in community mental health until I retired, and I really enjoyed my job. But it was when I sort of getting up to the point when my mother was just about to die. I mean, not literally, just about.
No, I understand.
It was a year or two before, and I thought, if I don't deal with some of this now, when she dies, I'm going to have great difficulty. That's actually what spurred me.
Yeah.
I had seen a therapist some years before, but that was related to whether I wanted to have children or not.
Sure.
And I guess that was all linked, really. But this time, it was...
It's all there, isn't it? It's all there.
Yeah, and I also think it's so important to talk about it. I felt like I worked in the mental health field. Therefore, when I talk to people who I know, I will talk quite openly about being in therapy and stuff. And people are often surprised because they think, "Oh, Sally, you don't."
You seem very together. You seem in control. You seem quite mistress of all you survey. You don't. So, but that's the point, isn't it? I'm the same. I talk about it a lot for exactly the same reason. It's we are evangelists, you and me.
Ooh.
Or at least evangelicals about therapy. Kathy just wants to say thank you. Please thank Sally. Lots of women went to private school, even if we didn't board, and will recognise themselves in her words. Please thank her for speaking up for women too. So I shall.
Nice.
And I will always add, I know, I mean, I think because the brutality that boys experienced was a little bit more visceral, and because way more boys go to these schools than girls. But you're right, of course, it's not for a moment. Not for a moment am I suggesting that it's uniquely confined to boys alone. Thank you, Sally. And that's the point. That's why we talk about it, because there'll be loads and loads of people who this can help. Amelia Cox has your headlines. It is 12:38, and it is a conversation about what has become known as boarding school syndrome, but it doesn't any more than I believe, or I'm conducting this conversation under the impression that it only happens to boys. Neither does abuse of any kind only happen at boarding school, but that is specifically what we're addressing today because of the intervention into this space by Charles Spencer, the brother of the late Diana, Princess of Wales, and because of the social problem it creates, which is that these are the schoolings, and things have changed a lot, although not completely. The schoolings that we still value. We still think that, we still create leaders, political leaders. Look at the last 4 prime ministers. Only Liz Truss didn't go to public school, didn't board at public school. And Theresa May, actually. So only the women. But Cameron, Johnson, Sunak. So a lack of empathy, which is instead sold to you as self-reliance, has huge social impacts. Some very emotional messages coming, and I can't read them all out, obviously, but I'll read a couple. Some quite personal as well, people who went to the same schools, literally the same schools as me. Simon writes, your monologue has brought me to tears. I recognise myself entirely and know that I'd have been a much nicer person without that upbringing. I'm trying to be that better person now, but it's taken me a lost lifetime to learn that. Well, better late than never, Simon, and I don't mean that in a trite fashion. This is a thought I hadn't had before. It's why they're also, quotes, anti-woke, James. They can't bear thinking of other people's disadvantages. I'd add to that because they've spent so much time convincing themselves that they don't have any vulnerabilities. And this is really interesting. I've just found myself repeating the same circle you describe with my sons, telling them it's only pain, run it off, and you must achieve at all costs. It's taken therapy to undo some of the damage that was done to me. The beatings by adults, the humiliations in front of my peers have all left a legacy that I will be working to overcome for the rest of my life. And then Darren just says, I'd ring in about this, James, but I don't fancy blubbing on the radio. I'm even going to have to turn you off. There we go again, repression at its finest. And you're right. And this from Charlie. I went to the same prep school as James, which I believe in hindsight was founded on the belief that male children needed to be separated from the enfeebling effects of love. It damaged me so much that I've never managed to get back to who I was prior to the age of 8. Although I did find it immensely healing to read James's description of that self-same school in his book. And it was the book, How Not to Be Wrong. But I would recommend the other books much more than mine on this one, actually. Sad Little Men by Richard Beard, all of Nick Duffel's work and Alex Renton's work, both in a book and in a lot of journalism on the experiences looking... I mean, in Alex's case, specifically at sexual abuse and similar, and then in Duffel's case, the psychological impact, and Richard Beard's book, Sad Little Men, looking at the kind of political impact of these formative years upon both the people that went through them and the societies that they ended up governing. Peter's in Hackney. Peter, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
So I'm in my early 60s. I was at boarding school in Scotland between 13 and 18.
Yes.
My family was in Africa, so there was no real choice. It wasn't particularly grim, but I got a couple of thoughts on bullying and the general effects it has on people. So the figures are slightly random, but I guess at the school I was at, maybe 10% of the people were really quite vicious bullies. About 10% were really badly picked on, and the rest of us kind of swum around in the middle, and you had your peers, and if you were unlucky, whatever. So I was in that middle group. But to your points about the effects on empathy, it's had quite the opposite effect. Because I saw what it did to other people, I grew to loathe bullying with a hatred, and that carried forward into my views on politics. And, for the weak, standing up for the weak, injustice, social justice, like that. So it wasn't that it hardened me to other people. It actually made me far more sensitive to what I perceived to be injustice and unfairness and bullying on a larger scale to people. So that carried forward. In terms of an individual, there are a couple of effects which probably are quite common. So there was a never show emotion in case it was a sign of weakness. So you shut shop. And that...
So you would be feeling the emotions inside, but not articulating them outwardly in your youth.
Absolutely.
God.
And obviously that carries forward into adult life with a sense of becoming difficult to know. So you're kind of suspicious of people until they prove themselves to be pleasant.
Yeah.
So I've had very good friendships in my life, and so I'm not complaining. But it was putting down the shutters that became a habit, and it made me difficult for other people to know unless they had the patience to do it.
And made you emotionally unavailable, I think is the phrase.
Yeah, might appear to be a bit standoffish, where naturopath was the opposite. The second effect was probably also quite common, the sort of perceived law of omerta. You never tell on other people.
Yeah.
It's a sort of a club thing. And again, that became a sort of habit of never asking for help. And again, that's a few years back, when I was going through a very bad patch. It was literally when I was almost on the streets before I asked for help. So there's that don't complain, don't say anything else. And the third wrinkle, which I found quite interesting, I grew up in quite a strong, not bigoted, quite a strong Christian environment.
Right.
And you imbue the ethics there, including turning the other cheek. So when I was all alone in boarding school wondering how to cope, I thought, okay, I'm going to apply this, turn the other cheek. And it had absolutely no effect. It was only when I began to fight back and people began to stop that I realized there was another way to do it. So, as I said, I don't have the horrible experiences of many people, but I think it was probably far more common for most.
But you're doing that thing. I think we both do that thing where we know other people had worse experiences, but that doesn't mean our experiences weren't bad.
No, that's right. So it hasn't been a deeply traumatic experience such as people who suffered really bad abuse have had, but it has had long-term and fairly significant effects.
Profound effects, which you don't know are traceable until you do the work, until you start looking into it. It doesn't cross your mind that you are like that because of what happened to little Peter, 40 years ago.
And it is fascinating that it is fascinating that so many people are talking about it, because you kind of think, am I alone? Am I the only one who went to a boarding school who felt this? But it's kind of comforting in a way to know that there are other people out there who can...
And that I think is why, albeit that he's not someone whose utterings I would ordinarily devote an hour of the programme to, it does matter that someone like Charles Spencer comes out and says it, because people like us probably think, well, I bet he was fine, because he's an earl. You know, these are the people that are fine in those contexts, the people that did used to run the empire. But no, he suffered just as much, if worse in some ways, than many other people.
But just to quickly, I do think it's important that empathy may be cauterized in some people, but in other people, seeing what was done to other people can actually have quite the opposite effect and really infuse and enthuse and... I think that's an important reminder, actually, is that you get exposed to injustice and it begins to burn inside you in a way that will stay with you as it has with you for the rest of your life. And Spencer picks up on your point about seeing other people and knowing other people have been through it. He goes, I frequently witnessed deep pain still flickering in the eyes of my Madewell contemporaries. That's his prep school. Talking about a particularly unpleasant matron there who would prey upon young boys sexually, but all the other areas as well of the loneliness and the damage. So widespread, and yet the whole system depends upon people like Peter and me and Charles Spencer and everyone else who's run the programme today. You know, never sort of acknowledging it, because to do so is to fall into the trap that you've spent your whole life avoiding, the trap of frailty, vulnerability, emotional literacy. It's 12:46. 12:50 is the time. And again, I stress, the experiences transcend the context. It is just that the context we're discussing today is boarding school. I nearly said your name then, you've asked me not to, but this texter gets it. I can't ring in, I'm working, but I got the light bulb moment when you were describing the symptoms about my dad. He didn't go to boarding school. But he was beaten as a kid at school in the late 70s and the early 80s, and he is 100% all of the things you've just described. Emotionally switched off, never showed anything but anger. He was never a bad dad. In fact, he was great at times, but he's always had a negative side. And I only ever remember seeing him cry once, and that was when I was around 8, and my mum left him. He didn't even shed a tear when his parents died. If you could not read my name out, if you do read this, that would be mint. There you go. I didn't. But that is it. There is something shameful about emotion. And then we're back to stiff upper lip. Why would we prize a stiff upper lip when it just is a fancy way of saying repressed? Bottling it all up, tightening down the lid on anger and upset and heartbreak and an abandoned child who was forced to look after himself or herself. Mad. And our society continues to prize this sort of education above almost all others. Andrew's in Tring. Andrew, what made you pick up the phone? Oh, Jess is in Brighton. Jess, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Hello, Jess.
Hello. It's a first-time caller here.
Welcome.
A lot of us really resounded. I've just felt so emotional listening to this calling, because I was married to a man like that for a long time, 25 years. And the last message you read out encapsulated everything, where I knew always deep down that he had his soft side, and there were times when, maybe 3 occasions, where he actually cried and showed that there was that soft side there. And one of those occasions was when I left him. But we had 3 boys, and his treatment of them was very much character building, in that same mode, character building, not emotionally available to them. And they are now in their 40s, and they want to confront him about all the problems that they perceive is all his fault. Even though I was there for them emotionally, but they feel very much that they want to blame all their problems on their father, who wasn't. And he's now, like you, admitted a few while ago, you said that you were kind of, you feel that you'd mellowed quite a bit now in your older age, and he too has mellowed. And I feel that he's now, from a practical point of view, he's being quite a good dad. Right. Even though he's still not able to show his emotions, he's now been relatively good compared to how he was when they were little. And so I've now managed to discourage them from having that big talk, and
Well, they might benefit from therapy themselves by the sounds of it, rather than... there you go.
Exactly. They are having it, yes. They are having therapy, but...
What's it like to live with? Because it's a generous thing you say, that you know there's a lovely person. The person you fell in love with is there, but they're quite far deeply buried sometimes, aren't they?
It's very hard because I was somebody who needed that demonstration of love and affection, and I just had to keep telling myself that softness was there, and I'm now married to somebody who is completely the opposite, and and it's wonderful. And he cries and he shows his emotions and he expresses his emotions, and we can talk openly about
the most normal
thing
like in the world you're describing, and yet for so many people it sounds abnormal or extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, he went for a very short time to a private school, but not for long enough to actually have any effect on him. And he's now, it's just incredible. He's just very, very open. He's completely the opposite of the stiff upper lip man that the English person has the reputation of being.
And much happier as a consequence, and a much healthier influence, and a much more positive presence in the lives of the people around him. It's incredible, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm really happy now.
Well, I'm glad you are. You deserve it. And I'm glad he sounds like he's in a better place as well. And I hope your boys get a little bit of closure as well, because it can only help, can't it?
Till I was 40, I stuck it out till I was 45, and we stayed good friends. And
that's nice.
From a practical point of view, he's still there, kind of looking after me in his own way,
yes,
and making sure I'm all right. So it's kind of good, but oh my God, it's so liberating being with someone who can actually talk about emotions.
Because otherwise you're trying to join the dots when you don't even know where the dots are. And that's why I said, you heard me say, I think you probably took that to heart when I said at the beginning, I wonder what it's like to love someone, to be with someone who is like this, and then have to deal with the consequences. And quite often there will be a lot of divorce, there will be a lot of infidelity, there will be a lot of emotional unavailability, and that means everybody's suffering in those relationships. Thank you, Jess. Take care. 12:56 is the time. I can't read out. I hope I don't sound distracted. I'm listening to every caller very carefully, but in between calls, some of the texts coming in are really, really heartbreaking and very emotional, very fair as well, very decent of people who didn't go through this background to talk about the revelation, if you like, that the people you'd always thought had got the winning lottery tickets in life, dealing with the kind of trauma that we've had. Andy puts it best. I'm currently sitting here in tears. We always taught to respect our betters, but all the people that you've spoken to this morning have suffered more so than most, and over such long periods of time. It is that thing of self-reliance. You're away and you're on your own, and you're constantly being told that you're among the luckiest people on the planet, and yet inside you feel anything but. And it's fine. Listen to me now, talking about it. That's how you can get there. Everyone can get there. So it's not easy necessarily, but it's certainly achievable. Even Charles Spencer is getting there. Everyone can get there. You just got to admit it. And how hard would it be for someone who'd never been to a boarding school in their life to accept that sending a child away at the age of 7 or 10 or 13 for weeks on end with no mother love or no contact with a parent in that entire period is somehow normal or admirable or desirable? It's just funny. It's so absurd. And yet here we are. Didn't do me any harm. Phil's in Derry. Phil, what would you like to say? Last word, I think.
Hi, James. I was at a boarding school. I'm 51 now. And I spent the first 30 years of adulthood just in a state of terror.
You mean your tummy? You mean fear, anxiety in your tummy?
Absolutely. That crushing feeling you get in just below your heart.
Yeah. Any minute now, I'm going to be under attack again. Something's going to happen. I'm living in hypervigilance, they call it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the skills of wearing a thick mask that no one can see through, that was the only thing I learned at that school, kind of got me through that terror. It didn't get me through the terror, but it allowed me to sort of rise above it and do things. But, I spent a lot of my life just wondering if I should just finish myself. Sorry, I should have given you a trigger warning there. But I've had therapy. And things are changing, but even now I feel that fear now. Just thinking about those days, it's
thinking about him because no one looked after him.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I felt from day one at boarding school. I remember being dropped off and watching the car drive away and thinking, now what? Yeah. And I had no family then, as far as I was concerned. When I finished school 5 years later, I ran away and I had no contact with my family. I detested them
for doing
for that.
Yeah,
that changed. Now, I've got a great relationship with my mum now, but that was years of.
It will get better.
Horror. And it
will get better, and it is getting better clearly. But that's the first thing you do. And what's mad, Phil, as you've probably worked out, you were surrounded by people going through exactly the same thing, but none of you ever admitted it to yourselves, or least of all to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I find interesting, and maybe I'm wrong, but an observation of the people I knew at school, the ones that were broken properly, they all went into the city.
Yeah.
The ones that weren't broken properly, we all ran for the hills. I ran away to join the fun fair, and I still live in Ireland, and I never went back. I still can't speak to people. If someone's wearing a suit, I want nothing to do with them.
Yes, it goes so deep, doesn't it? It really does. Mate, you've taken me up to the wire. I wish you well, and you're on a good and important journey. That was a mad hour. That was so powerful. Thank you to everybody who helped make it so. If you missed any of it, you can listen back. In fact, if you missed any of the whole show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick even is back from... back in his normal slot, and Sheila Fogarty has never been away from hers.
Never been away. Sat here all weekend. 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 Been away.